The opinions you hear on Your Mountain from individual hosts or guests do not necessarily represent those of Your Mountain, our sponsors, or other entities we're affiliated with professionally or otherwise. You've waited long enough. Go listen to the show.
There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is Your Mountain.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back for another episode of the Your Mountain podcast. I'm your host, David Wilms. Cheers to Nephi Cole across the screen.
Hello, Dave.
Sheridan. Hey, Nephi. How's it going?
You know what, Dave? It's a beautiful day. I am very, what's exciting that we're talking about the subject we're talking about today, because everybody's going to get this. If we are not lazy and we get it out, you're going to get this as this is a July 4th gift. 250 years of being Americans, and you have us to thank for giving you this wonderful podcast on July 4th.
Well, 249 years.
Well, who's counting?
But who's really counting? But we're about to have a whole bunch of money for a 250-year celebration.
How are we getting
next
that?
Year.
Oh, you mean...
Isn't there an appropriation in the big, beautiful bill to help pay for festivities in 2026?
I don't know. There may be. I'm not sure. I thought maybe you were saying that we personally were going to get money for that, and I was very excited about that.
No, that's not happening. You know
that sounds like that sounded like a better deal to me when you were saying that.
I got to ask you a question before we dive in.
Yeah.
So we know what we're recording this on a Thursday. We know that over the last weekend, the land provision was taken out of the Senate reconciliation package that was then passed and went to the House. What did you, which effectively meant that any land sales in this bill were dead. What did you do to celebrate that decision?
Dave, what I did was I sat and reflected on what a challenging issue and topic this is. And being the pragmatic, nonpartisan individual that I am, I sat down. It wasn't so much a celebration of the passage. I just patted myself on the back for being a know-it-all. And you should too. Because, really, when you went back and looked at this, I am not surprised by the outcome one bit. And I don't think that you are either. And that doesn't mean that individuals and entities didn't work their butts off for the outcome that happened. That, for sure, there were people behind the scenes that were just, there were a lot of sleepless nights, and there was a lot of, work on social media platforms and real outreach and work on the Hill. And there's a lot of, carbon footprint as people burned the airline miles to get to DC to have those discussions. But I think that the outcome was actually, if you were a betting man in Vegas, this is what we expected. We expected this outcome. That doesn't mean you don't have to work for this outcome. That would be a huge mistake to say that, like, oh yeah, this would have happened with nobody there. It wouldn't have. It wouldn't have happened without all the people who were involved. It wouldn't have happened without all the things that happened in the backdrop. But it just goes to show you that, if you, the good guys, I don't want to, classify them as good guy, bad guy, but the good guys win.
Yeah. I kind of like the way you set that up. I did some a little different, by the way. Then we'll get into this a little bit.
Okay. What did you do to celebrate?
I went camping on public lands with my family. And it was awesome. We had the best sunset I've ever seen, probably because of the situation we were in. And it was had a great time. But you're right. It was not an unexpected outcome. I guess I would say it was an expected outcome. But there was a ton of work. A ton of work that went into getting that outcome. And I think the reason it was, and I'll just expand a little bit, I think the reason it was an expected outcome is because we knew that the public as a whole is very passionate about public lands. very passionate about not privatizing these lands, right? And so we expected that when people realized that this provision was real, that there was an actual real chance that a bill could be passed that would include selling, millions of acres of public lands, that people would rise up against that. And they did, from all walks of life and all political parties, and, came together in just pretty amazing ways. So the outcome, it was maybe what you'd expect because of the issue and how we knew people would rise up. But it went down to the absolute wire.
You got to give it to
absolute wire.
Yeah, you got to give it to both sides. There was a lot of there was some surprises. There were some real surprises. I was really surprised at the tenacity of Mike Lee and coming back time and again. I was surprised that eventually the parliamentarian said this works. There's a lot that went on there. I mean, this is one to write, this is one to write in your journal about, to talk about how it happened and kind of the argument. Because I don't think, I would have to say, I think that this was the most, I'd say it's the closest anybody's ever gotten to getting something of this scope done in 50 plus years.
I mean, if you want to take an analogy and make this a football game, I would say that it ended on a goal line stand on the 1 yard line in the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl, right? And, Mike Lee was running trick play after trick play to get down there to the 1 yard line. And he tried to run one last play in the playbook to push it across the goal line, and the defense stiffened up and, knocked it back. That's how I'd analogize this. Because I've been using football analogies for a lot of this public land stuff. I said the Utah lawsuit going to the Supreme Court right away was like throwing a Hail Mary on the first play of the game, and then you go back and you play the game, right? Well, this was, they marched down the field, and it took stiffening up at the 1 yard line on the last play of the Super Bowl to win this thing.
Yeah,
it was that close.
Yeah,
I want to be clear about that. It was that close.
Yeah, and Lee put out I think it was a tweet, right, where he said like, "Hey, Hunter Nation, I heard you," right at the end of it, which is very interesting in a couple different ways. I think number one, he recognized that it was really a huge part of this was the hunting public and how they felt about it. In particular, I think it's because a lot of the hunting public, you have a lot of conservatives in that recreational use group. And so that's a use group that this will come up later in our discussion. That's extremely important. Why? Because it keeps this from being a partisan issue. And so you're not at the position with something like federal lands where you can just say like, as soon as we get one party in versus another party, we're going to be able to ramrod this through. Because if that was the case, it would have passed. But what you saw, in particular, at the end of the day, a lot of pushback, a lot of phone calls, and ultimately, whether people want to believe it or not, Republican leadership, I believe, probably put their thumb on the scale and said, this ain't going to happen. And I don't know how much we want to talk about that or not, but I think it's important to recognize at this moment, there are people that are still trying to politicize this as a partisan issue. And it is not a partisan issue. It was a bipartisan coalition that came together and said, no, not on this watch.
Yeah, it really was. You got to remember, it was a singular person issue. It was one person that happened to hold the gavel for an important committee for this bill, right, that included this provision in the committee bill. That provision didn't go through a normal committee hearing or markup, anything like that. It was Senator Lee drafted the ENR, Energy and Natural Resources Committee bill language for the big beautiful bill and sent it along. to the parliamentarian for review and to leadership for inclusion in the overall package, and happened to put it in there. And then once it's in there, there are processes for getting it out, right? And that's what the fight was about. To your point, it wasn't a partisan issue. It was a singular person's ethos issue, right? That might have been carried by some others. And I know that's what we wanted to talk about some, is like, how did we get to the point? So this is sort of a two-part discussion, right? How did we get to the point where Senator Lee introduced this bill, and also where on the House side you had Representatives Amade and Malloy introducing sell-off language for Nevada and Utah? How did we get to the point that this became such a centerpiece of the discussion of this overall bill, this land disposal effort, land sale effort? How do we get there? That's the first part.
Well, I'd like to
start. The second part of this is,
go ahead.
And the second part is, okay, where do we go from here? This happened. This process happened. The language was pulled. The bill is going to move forward without it. What reflections do we take from this, and where do we go from here? Into the next 18 months, 3 years, 5 years. So we'll talk some about that too. Right? I think that's kind of the idea here. This is sort of I view this as like, this is the autopsy of this event.
Well, I think a place to start is by acknowledging that we have a problem. And let's admit what the problem is. And the problem is, and this is interesting, I think that Lee said we have an affordable housing issue, right? But if you looked at the bill that was brought and the way that it was brought, it was consistently more than that. It was bigger than that, right?
It had nothing to do with affordability the way it was drafted.
There was a lot of other stuff there. And so that got us, it got me to looking at some different maps and talking to some different people. And one of the things that I noted, and this is a real thing, there are communities in places like southern Utah that there are counties that are 95% federal lands where they can't afford to keep up with the roads in their counties because the counties are so big and the landowners don't pay taxes because it's the federal government. And there are communities in southern Utah that are 100% surrounded, where like literally that community, it can't grow. And there's a reason it can't grow. And I'm going to use Moab as an example. The community of Moab, Utah, when it was created, we all know how BLM lands tended to be those areas that were not suitable for something else, right? And we'll get more into the nitty-gritty of this in a few minutes. But that community, you only have so much private land that was ever allocated to the public by the various acts where that could be disposed of. And so you have a very small private land holding surrounded by federal land. And interestingly enough, the nature of that community has changed over time, where instead of being a small community that's about mineral extraction and ranching, suddenly you have a huge recreational base in that community. You have a lot of people coming in that want to live in a place like that want to recreate in that place. And there's no place to go. There is no opportunity for growth there. And so, when that comes up as like hey, we need to do this. Well, I think we all agree that there are situations like that need to be looked at. That wasn't this. But, you can see how, there are valid arguments, just because we don't like the entire premise of an argument doesn't mean that there aren't points of that argument, that there aren't bullet points that really hold water. And that's, that may be the case in this. We wanted to talk a little bit about it, but I want to start, Dave. Can I start where I want to start?
Yeah, maybe. Where do you want to start?
July 4th, 1776. Because of the date that it is. So July 4th, 1776, America declares its independence from the British Empire. Well, why is that important? Well, it's the 13 colonies, right? That's the original landmass of the United States. And there's, all these discussions that'll come up later that are just ridiculous about, the Washington, D.C. being the only holding that they can have. But that's the start. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris doubles the size of the colonies. So when the war actually gets over, we had an interesting thing happen, which is we had those 13 colonies plus all this land west past the proclamation line to the Mississippi River now becomes the property of who?
Well, so actually, I'm going to back you up a
Yeah,
little bit
do it.
because there was a big dispute over this because those lands were originally claimed by a number of the original colonies.
That's right. It's the C to C the C to C grants.
Yeah.
So Connecticut, who else? Connecticut, Virginia, and Massachusetts. Their state charter says that they're from C to C. They get everything, Atlantic to the Pacific.
Right. And so it became actually a big controversy over, you had the smaller colonies worried that these land claims by some of the bigger colonies would enable larger colonies to become more powerful than them. That was one of the big concerns. And so you had this, the founders, during the creation of the United States, required required those states to give up claim to those lands between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, right? And part of that was it was to create this stronger, more centralized federal government. They created the property clause in the Constitution and gave the Congress the authority over those lands, the territories, and other property of the United States, and included the ability then to admit new states to take these land holdings then that were given up by the colonies and use those to create new states, for example. So they had to, admitting states into the Union meant the colonies had to surrender the claims to those lands to the federal government prior to being admitted.
And there was even argument among different colonies about who had what. For example, the Connecticut, or it's the Connecticut Reserve, New York and Pennsylvania were given royal charters that sat on top of land that already belonged to Connecticut through that reserve. So it's just interesting, when you look at kind of the backdrop of these land arguments.
Yeah. So over the first couple of decades, right, of the original United States, these territories were ceding these claims to the United States. And by 1802, all territory west of the colonies for the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, which was roughly 236 million acres, became, I'd call them public lands, right? They became controlled by the federal government to the extent that they weren't already states.
And there were uprisings in this area. If you remember, there are things like there are discussions, there's kerfuffles, there's discussions on taxation, there's rebellions. There's all sorts of interesting history that has to do with these, this territory in the history of the U.S.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't know if you want to get into some of that stuff, or if
we
you
don't
want
have
to
time.
continue the territorial expansion.
Let's continue the expansion
really
westward. So 1803, the Louisiana Purchase comes about. The Louisiana Purchase, we didn't even know what we were buying with the Louisiana Purchase. We had no idea what the northern extent of that was. And of course, that's where the Lewis and Clark expedition comes into play. Lewis and Clark, the president, puts together this expedition after, there's an argument in Congress about whether or not they wanted this land or not, but he ended up getting it. And then he sends Meriwether Lewis and a group of men to figure out exactly what we ended up buying. And so they head up the Missouri River to follow it as far as it would go to try and figure out how much land we just purchased.
Yeah. I'm going to do a quick side tangent here really quick because it just reminded me. So I teach this class on wildlife law, and when we talk about this and we talk about the current situation in wildlife law and current species, and I tie it back to the history a little bit. We just had license draws, tag draws recently for hunting season here in Wyoming. One of the things you don't need to have a license for, although you need a stamp now, is for sage grouse. To hunt sage grouse. We're one of the few states where you can still do that. I always get a bunch of grief from people because I don't hunt sage grouse very often anymore because I find it virtually inedible. Like, I just think it's so disgusting. And people say you're not trying hard enough. There are all these different ways to make it taste good. And I hear some people talk about how good it is. And I always respond by, if you go back and read Meriwether Lewis's journey or journals from his trip across the Louisiana Purchase, like they're just trying to survive on anything. Like they'll eat anything, like literally anything, and except sage grouse. Like he describes these sage grouse as I'm not going to get his exact language right, but they were not top shelf table fare is the way I'd put it. They were he didn't find them to be very good. Sorry, that's a big tangent, but every time anybody mentions Meriwether Lewis, it gets me thinking about sage grouse and how disgusting they are, and how Meriwether Lewis and I have that in common.
Very good. So 1821. The Spanish claims, this is what I have in my notes, you can correct me where I'm wrong. Spanish claims to the Oregon Territory are ceded, but there's still some discussion with Britain. We kind of share some of that area for a while.
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna blast through some of the stuff, right?
Yeah,
you can go through every purchase if you want, but you mentioned the Louisiana Purchase from France, Mexican secession, Gadsden Purchase from Mexico, purchased Florida from Spain, purchased Alaska from Russia. All of this stuff between all of these purchases between 1803 and when was Hawaii was purchased in something like 1896, somewhere thereabouts. Alaska was, I can't remember the exact year it was purchased, but over the course of this roughly 100-year time frame, through acquisitions of purchasing, through secession, through war. I mean, remember, the U.S. fought wars with Native American tribes all the way across the country to cede their those lands,
take native lands,
and to acquire native lands, right? To expand all the way from the Pacific to or from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Those acquisitions added about 1.6 billion with a B billion acres to the public domain of the United States.
So I think this,
at one time or another, the U.S. held 1.8 billion acres of land in the federal estate, and then
that's a lot of land, Dave.
That's a lot.
That's a lot of land.
And then we'll get to what happened
Wait a minute.
next.
Yeah, because I don't understand. The U.S. had 1 billion acres,
almost 2 billion acres.
How do I have a house? Well, that's important, and I think that's critical because, like, I heard there was I have lots of friends in the ranching community, but there was a rancher who stood up and very vociferously, wanted to talk about this, federal lands issue, and I think that's appropriate. These public lands are appropriate; they belong to all of us. We should care about that. But we have to be honest, and I think it's kind of disingenuous not to recognize that if you live west of the Mississippi and you own land, whose land do you own? You're on federal land right now. If you live in a city, a town, a community, a municipality, if you're someplace, just remember, unless you're like really early in this country, the land that you sit on was once federal ground. It was once federally owned land. And so there was a decision made at some point that for certain uses, we were going to divest some of that federal estate for certain uses. And you can't, I think, have a strong argument as to why you need to protect some of these areas without first acknowledging how we got here and that we all are standing on what used to be federal ground. And so I think that's not all of us, I guess, but most of us.
Yeah. Well, what used to, and I'll go back in front, used to be tribal ground, then became federal ground, and then you and I purchased our land, right? There've been multiple transfers of this property
from a variety of countries and a variety of interests, people claiming interest in ownership, and it's interesting. So where do you want to start on, or the acts of that turned the federal estate into your house?
Let me start here at the very beginning, right? Because I think it's important. We need to be honest. Like you said, we need to be honest. And from the beginning, from the foundation of this country, it was It was the policy of the federal government to dispose of these lands. They acquired these lands. The federal government acquired these lands pursuant to the property clause. But it was the policy. Now, there's a difference between, and we can get into this later if you want, the constitutionality of ownership of land versus the policy making, the decision making of Congress on disposing of the lands that they held. Those are two different questions. Like, what lands are you allowed to hold forever? That's the basis of Utah's lawsuit. Versus, what was the policy of the Congress with lands? The policy of the Congress of the country from its early days was, we're going to sell this or otherwise get rid of it. Not just sell. We're going to dispose of these lands one way or another. And so
now, when you say
at
that,
first we needed a means to do it.
two things before you move on to the means when you say that. So first, remember this. So two things: law, policy, not always the same thing. One can live inside the other. And so while I would argue, and I believe that the constitutional law on this is fairly settled, the other thing to look at, though, policy can change. And policy has changed. And we'll talk more about that in the future. But just remember, just because the policy was this thing doesn't mean it is this thing. And just because it is this thing doesn't mean it can't be that thing. And so that's important.
That's right. So go back to the very beginning. And 1785, the Continental Congress enacted the Land Ordinance of 1785. If you want to dispose of lands, you need a universal method to do it. Like, how are we going to measure it? How are we going to divide it? That kind of thing. And the Land Ordinance created a standardized system of federal land surveys. It using astronomical starting points. So think of it as, in the most simple terms, it's what created this grid system with a unit of measurement that we call the township. And a township is a square that has 6 miles on each side and divided into 36 sections. So a township is made up of 36 square miles, each square being a section, and each section being 1 mile or 640 acres. Okay. When this was passed, Section 16 in each of these townships was reserved for the maintenance of public schools, and the federal government transferred it to states at the time of admission. Now, this was early on, because you'll hear later we talk about 2 or 4 or even 8 sections of land transferring at admission. In the 1785 ordinance, it was 1 section. Section 16 went to the states, okay, to be able to help pay for the maintenance of public schools. Everything else in those sections, those other 35 sections, it was the objective of the federal government to sell those at that time. That's what they did. And they did it for a lot of reasons. So they originally sold public lands to generate revenue for the treasury, not to encourage settlement. That came later. So under the land ordinance, if an individual wanted to purchase public land, they were required to purchase the full section, and they had to pay a minimum of $1 per acre for 640 acres. That was for the first 15 years. Or not 15 years, a couple more than that. Anyway, in 1800, Congress then passed the Harrison Land Act, which said, okay, maybe you don't all want to buy 640 acres. We'll half that to 320 acres, and then fix the price. Instead of a minimum of $1, it's going to be a fixed price of $1.25 an acre. But even with that, so what the government's trying to do here is facilitate sale of lands. They're making it, you can buy a little bit less, you don't have to bid, it can be a fixed price, a low price, and the government could still not generate the desired revenue that it wanted from those land sales. They were finding that even in the eastern part of the country, where a lot of this was happening at the time, that the less desirable parcels of property just didn't sell. You'll hear more about that here in a second when you really think about what's a less desirable piece of property, but they just weren't selling.
So they were selling this land. And the other thing, I think, again, if you're anybody that's got family of like Revolutionary War history, the federal government not only tried to sell the lands, but they also used it to help pay their private debts. So things that they owed, for example, they pay soldiers by giving them land. And so you see that this was a commodity that the federal government used in a variety of ways.
Oh, for sure. And jumping to that in 1 second, but finishing this thought on how they were incentivizing the sale of these lands, to generate money for the treasury. They in 1854, Congress passed the Graduation Act, which created a graduated scale for selling lands, meaning they adjusted the land prices to reflect the desirability of a lot. So if a parcel had been on the market for 30 years, that's right, 30 years, then the price per acre was reduced to 12.5 cents per acre. 12.5 cents an acre. Now, I haven't done the inflation adjustment on that, but that's still going to be a good deal, right? And it was because the federal government was trying everything it could think of to privatize all of these lands. They wanted to be out of the land business. And then to your point, you had the military piece, right? So in Continental Congress in 1776 passed a resolution that issued land as compensation for service, right? So several million acres in Ohio were reserved for veterans of the Revolutionary War, as an example. And after the War of 1812, the federal government reserved another 6 million acres in Michigan, Illinois, and Louisiana for veterans as well. And then in 1855, law awarded 160 acres to veterans or widows or minor children of any war since 1790, anywhere in the federal estate. So not just limited to states, but absolutely anywhere. So in between 1776 and 1862, when the government was giving land as payment or as thanks for fighting in foreign wars, or for fighting for the United States, the U.S. transferred about 61 million acres of public lands to more than 500,000 military veterans. That was not to raise, to your point, Nephi, not to raise revenue for the federal government. That was as a way to compensate soldiers for their service to the United States. And then, after the military bounties, then I would jump to land grants to states. And I think this is a really important one because you'll start seeing where some of, for example, Utah's and maybe some other Western states' concerns come into play. But I don't know if you want to talk about that or do you want me to talk about land grants?
You can talk about it. I just think it's one of the things that I noticed when there's a lot of this in the background. And when you go to start looking at all these, you'll find that not even Wikipedia or Grok or your other AI, they don't all get it right. There's just so much history in this and stuff that's overlaying on other pieces of it. It's not a simple issue to unwind.
Yeah, and I'll tell you what, if I'm cheating a little bit, and here's how I'm cheating.
Okay.
Because 2 years ago, I wrote a legal paper on the history, and it was related to the corner crossing case, but I did a whole section on the history of land management in the U.S. and how it got us to the point of the land ownership we have today and how that led to the corner crossing disputes we have.
Oh,
so I might be cheating a little bit by using crib notes from a paper I wrote, trying to aggregate all of this stuff.
I was trying to pull up more information on it, and I had are you familiar with the 1850 Donation Land Claim Act?
I've heard of it because you just said it.
Yeah. Anyway, there was just like this. There's this stuff in the backdrop where I'm trying to find the Organic Act, and what AI gives you is this other thing that talks about racism. I'm like, no, I just want to know about the 1848 Organic Act. Okay, there we go.
All right. So land grants to states. I mentioned that one, that every 16th section going to early states. But here's the deal. As a condition of being admitted to the Union, states were required, and this is in states' constitutions and in the Organic Act for the states, right? States were required to give up claim to public lands within their borders. So any lands that are owned by the federal government, as a condition of statehood, the state could not have any claim to any of those lands. And in a lot of places, in a lot of these state constitutions or organic acts, they're called the unappropriated lands. Any of the unappropriated lands, They have to give up claim to those. That just means really any lands that aren't already owned
by
by
title,
a private entity.
Yep.
The fee title by a private entity. So, but in return for that, so the states give up claim to everything. But in return for that, the federal government transferred more than 328 million acres of those federal lands to states to help finance public education and for some other purposes as well. With a few notable exceptions like Alaska, Hawaii, Maine, Texas, and West Virginia, new states were granted 1 to 4 sections of every township. So you and I being in Wyoming was granted 2 sections in every township, sections 16 and 36. Right? Some states were granted 4, and some others. But a total of 328 million acres of lands were transferred to the states as a condition of statehood. And then all the claim to everything else stayed with the federal government. And they continued this effort to try and sell or otherwise dispose of the lands.
And their motivations changed. So at first, their motivations primarily, I don't know how much you want to get into this, but we will because we're going to get into the other acts that followed. But it started to be a different focus. It started to be a focus after the Louisiana Purchase. There started to be a little bit of a focus on manifest destiny. This idea of filling up the continent with, in between the two coasts. And so how do you do that? What's the goal? The goal shifts from being, hey, we just need to look at our coffers and we need to pay back some debts. The goal of the United States shifts to being, okay, how can we get people out into this country? How can we get communities? How can we get economic development out into this country?
Yeah, and I'm going to go into that in 1 second, but I wanted to finish this land grants to states piece because this is going to tee up a future discussion, I think.
Yep.
I think it's an important note. So remember I said the federal government transferred more than 328 million acres of these federal lands to states to finance public education. Well, 328 million. You want to guess how many there are today still still owned by states? Nationwide.
Less than 10%.
Well, I don't want to do it in percentages. Give me a number.
I don't have any idea.
45 million acres.
Oh, I was close.
So there's of the 328 million that were originally transferred to the states, there are still 45 million acres of state trust lands in 20 states. Some states don't have any, right? States like Nevada and California sold almost all of those lands. Utah, I think, has sold more than half. There's 45 million of the 328 million left. And states who retain those, so they use it for things like grazing, mining, oil and gas development, and other activities. Like their focus has to be on generating revenue to help finance public schools and other public institutions. That's what all the other state constitutions say. That was the condition of statehood. They have to maximize revenue off of those state parcels. And sometimes the maximum revenue is actually selling the parcels to generate the money for schools.
And that's a policy decision in each state, right? The states make those decisions over time, and then they develop kind of how they're going to do business. So for example, in Wyoming, you're not going to see very many state acres getting sold. And that hasn't been the case in other states. Some states, and that's because there's this idea, some states say well, we're going to get more value out of these state lands by leasing these state lands, by developing minerals on these state lands, and other states have just decided that real estate is the best way to get value out of those state lands. And that's a policy decision that happened in each state.
Right. But the one thing that's consistent is they all have to try and maximize the revenue for their schools. And they make the policy decision on what's the best way to do that.
Yeah, and again, that's a really squishy thing to say, right? Because when you're saying we're going to, maximize the return for schools, well, in what? What's my time frame?
I know.
It's really squishy.
It is, for sure. All right. So to your next thing of...
By the way, I want everybody to know this is just proof. Dave and I do not talk about this before. We're like, what should we talk about on the podcast? And then we fire up the podcast and we go. So there's just sometimes we'll jump ahead, go behind, but this is This is as organic as it gets. So I just want you guys to know.
Super organic.
There we go.
So here we are with land grants to railroad corporations and Homestead Act. Let's talk about both of those things.
What's your
for a
date
second,
on this one?
What's my date?
Yeah. Oh, what are you looking at? It doesn't matter. Go ahead. Doesn't matter.
So for railroad corporations, we're looking at between 1850 and 1871. There are many different acts of Congress that facilitated the development of railroad. But you had mentioned, Nephi, and I think that's why I wanted to go here next, was you'd mentioned of this manifest destiny, this sea to shining sea, this let's populate the area, right? Well, in order to do that, you needed transportation infrastructure.
Yep.
And that's where the rail comes in.
Because how do you motivate a company, a private entity? How do you motivate them if you're the United States government? What's our way to get them to build a rail line all the way across the country?
Well, and Congress felt like they couldn't actually appropriate money to a private company. They felt like maybe
fair.
there was
Seems like a good idea.
Some ethical or moral or maybe legal reasons why you can't just send a whole bunch of money to one company, public money to one private company to build something. And so instead of just an appropriation to a company to build the railroad, they said, we'll incentivize them a different way, and we'll give land grants to these companies, and they can use that land. They can sell it if they want to help finance it. They can harvest the timber off of it to build rail ties. They can mine it for the steel, whatever they need, or the iron, like whatever they need. The idea was, we're going to give you this land, and
you're going to build a railroad.
And you're going to build a railroad.
I actually think that's a really interesting and innovative way to get them to do the work, if you think about it. Because if you give somebody just a giant checkbook, they're much more likely to waste money than if you say, okay, here's some resources that you can earn money on, but you're going to have to tap the resources. That's, good job, Congress. It's good thinking.
Yeah. Now, at its core, they were saying you could use the raw materials and everything, but at the core, they thought Congress would sell these lands to finance the construction of the rail. And then by selling those lands, that would spur settlement and economic development along the railroad. Right? And by doing that, the interest from the public to purchase federal lands would increase. So let me tell you what that means. So in the infinite wisdom of Congress, they decided we're going to give the railroad companies every odd-numbered section along each side of the tracks right-of-way. And then the federal government would retain the even-numbered sections. And these right-of-ways could be 10 miles, 20 miles, even as wide as in one instance 160 miles. Like these really expansive land holdings. And when you give the company every other odd section, and when you keep every other even section, what does that make?
Checkerboard. Which is really interesting if you think about it. Just step back and remember, we look at a checkerboard now, and if this has gotten confusing in this discussion, remember that it wasn't going to be checkerboard. The idea of the government was, hey, this is a great idea. We're going to give half of it to these private individuals. They're going to develop everything because it's close to the railway, and then everybody else will want to homestead / buy the even numbers. So this is a win-win for us. So just, again, it's important to know where we came from when we get mad about checkerboard and where it is and what it is. Remember that the intent of checkerboard was that it wouldn't exist.
Yeah, the idea was everything was going to be privatized.
Yep.
Right? There would be no federal land there. And this actually worked east of the 100th meridian, which is, this invisible north-south line. It divides the arid western lands from the more humid eastern lands, right? So if anything, everything east of that 100th meridian, that plan worked. Like the federal government and railroad companies sold almost all of their lands. They had some of the most fertile ground in the country, the breadbasket of America, people buying up all that land for building farms and all that kind of stuff, right? So, and little towns popping up all along the way.
Yeah.
And it worked.
The Jeffersonian ideal of the yeoman farmer, right? And that's what was happening. We're going to create opportunity. All you have to do is you have to be it's the free soil party and whatnot. Like, you're going to be able to move in there, and by the sweat of your own brow, you're going to be able to make a living doing this.
Yeah. And at the same time this was happening, so before we talk about west of the 100th meridian and what that looked like, at the same time these land grants to railroad corporations were happening in that 1850 to 1871 timeframe, the Homestead Act passed in 1862. So Congress passes this Homestead Act, and that was the way to facilitate westward expansion and settlement. Right? So you're going to have the railroad company getting every other parcel of land and looking to sell it, and then the federal government retaining land. And the idea was, how are we going to incentivize people to purchase these 640 acre parcels, right? Or less. And so what they did is they passed the Homestead Act, and there were 3 steps under the Homestead Act to a homestead acquisition. First, you needed to file an application for 160 acres. Then you needed to improve that land for 5 years, usually through irrigation or cultivation. And then if you did that, you could get a deed of title. Or you could live on the land for 6 months, make some trivial improvements to it, and pay $1.25 an acre. So there was the fast track path of, I'll just pay for it. Or there's I'm going to work the land for 5 years and I'm just going to get it for no cost, right? This Homestead Act caused more than 270 million acres to be claimed and settled, like 10% of the land area of the United States. 270 million acres that were claimed under the Homestead Act. But for some reason, when you hit that 100th meridian, those claims, like east of that 100th meridian, claims were all over the place, right? So west of that 100th meridian, where were claims typically found, Nephi?
West? Oh, yeah. It's along the water.
Yeah.
It's along the waterway. Before we get to talking about the water and how that affected it, there was controversy still during this time period. And anybody that doesn't think there was, Dave, what happened in 1860, 1861?
What happened in when?
1860, 1861.
Oh, you mean like Civil War kind of stuff?
Yeah. The southern states just said, we are sick of this entire ideal. We're sick of this entire experiment. We're out. And in 1865, the northern states said, no, you're not. But just remember that, these land controversies, like this controversy, it's not easy to package this thing up and to say like everything was one way and everybody felt one way and all things were good. And, there was a lot of controversy with every step of this. And there was still controversy within our nation at the time of whether or not some of us even wanted to be part of this manifest destiny issue. So I think it's just interesting to, put ourselves in, this is all happening in the backdrop of things that we all recognize as historically very important.
For sure. You're spot on. On that westward piece. So, because we're getting to the point of why do we have 640 million acres of public lands right now?
Yeah.
Right?
Well, think about the Homestead Act. And when you talk about going west, there's one, this ties so much into Wyoming history and the history of the West and why it looks like it looks and all the good cowboy movies and everything. The Homestead Act, you're giving out land based on the great things that are happening east, right? Where you've got enough water to where a guy, and, some horses and a little bit of, a plow where you can go out and you can make a living.
You mean like because it rains a lot and the rivers are full all the time?
Water, right? Because there's water. And
the dirt is
east of the 100th meridian. Yep. It's like the soil's better. You have more organics in the soil, and water's a waste product. The Army Corps of Engineers' whole purpose is to try and keep you from getting flooded out. That doesn't exist when you move west. The Army Corps has a few facilities really high up on the Missouri that they keep just out of jealousy to pretend like they care about big dams and saving water, but they don't. Even those facilities are managed when for example, Wyoming is the dividing line. When you get to Wyoming, you have a few Army Corps of Engineer dams, and those dams, like the dam at Glendo, is managed to control flood water. It's not managed to control irrigation water, even though it's used for
But that's a
irrigation.
Bureau of Reclamation project, I think.
It's shared, no. And
Is it shared?
No, it's shared. It's managed by the Corps. That's why it's managed by the Corps. The Glendo is managed by the Corps, and that's why you get this unique thing in Glendo. You know how they take the water down no matter what late in the year. Everybody out of state's not going to care about this, but that's why you can't access the docks with your boats past a certain time of year, because they could really care less about keeping water up for agricultural uses and for you to drive your boat around. That facility is managed to control floodwater. It's managed by the Corps. And so when you move to Bureau of Rec facilities aren't managed for flood control, although that's their secondary purpose. So just the way Corps of Engineer properties could be used for irrigation, but that's a secondary purpose. And so that's, you divide down the middle of the country, and that's what you get, a different water management mentality on both sides. On the right-hand side of the country, you have people managing for flooding. On the left-hand side, you have people trying to keep that water so they can put it to beneficial use. And that's a total change in paradigm when you got to the West. And that affected how people settled the West. Because no longer, if you think about it, the Homestead Act, these acts that provide you 120 acres, you could not make a living. It was very difficult to make a living on 120 acres, and you could not do it if you weren't next to a river, if you weren't next to a source of irrigation water, because you couldn't grow anything. And you have to grow enough stuff. If you're going to keep that land, you have to improve it.
I was sitting here scratching my head. The whole time you were talking, I'm sitting here thinking about Glendo, because I'm like, man, I spent the early part of my career representing the state engineer's office, working on North Platte settlement implementation. And I'm just racking my brain. I'm like, the Bureau of Reclamation manages Glendo Reservoir below the flood pool, above flood pool.
It's the Corps.
It's the Corps.
Yep.
But generally speaking, most of the time it's Bureau of Reclamation managing that.
It's a weird little shared scenario on Glendo. But that's why you have that water drawdown issue on Glendo. I'm sorry, Dave, I know that everybody wants us to get into the details of management of Glendo Reservoir on the podcast, but that's the next podcast. Management scheme for Glendo Reservoir.
Yeah, we're going to move downstream. I'm going to tell you one more funny. Maybe I've probably told this before, but I'm going to say it again. Have I told the story about when I worked for, as a high school student or early college, and working at the game and fish department, managing the visitor center, and people would come in looking for fishing licenses, and I'd look out the front window and look at what the license plates were.
Yeah.
And if they were Colorado plates, I'd send them to Guernsey Reservoir to fish. The best fishing in the state. If you can't catch a fish there, you can't catch anything there, or you can't catch anything anywhere. And it was because Guernsey gets drained completely
every year.
So there's no fish in it.
Yeah.
Except the occasional one that comes downstream from Glendo. And I always I smile every time I think about that. I always wonder, all the people I sent there with the green plates, did any of them ever catch a fish? Did they ever come back? I was not good for our tourism industry. So Homestead Act, yeah.
So one more story first. See, so this is the difference in perspective, because I had to argue with the Army Corps of Engineers all the time about Glendo. That was my argument, where you were arguing with the Bureau of Rec for downstream stuff. I was arguing about that top 15 feet of the flood pool, trying to keep it up so we could use it differently. So that's kind of funny.
Yeah, that is funny. So looking at the West, then, like you said, because homesteading really only occurred in the places that were close to water, where you could have water, where you could irrigate, because you weren't going to get the water falling out of the sky to do you any good. You really needed to be able to irrigate. Most of the other stuff didn't sell. And so you ended up with this east of that 100th meridian, all of this land was privatized. West of the 100th meridian, a lot of it wasn't. But also, remember back in 1792 or whatever, or 1792, whatever I said it was, when the country first started this policy of land disposal. Well, as as the railroad is moving across the country, and as the Homestead Act is in full gear and lands being acquired, the federal government is starting to do some stuff. They're starting to recognize that maybe there are places we actually shouldn't sell. And you start to see some policy shifts towards retention of these lands that originally the idea was, let's sell them. And it starts with Yellowstone National Park, creating the world's first national park in 1872. Yosemite is not far behind. Right. So in the 1870s, you're starting to see there are a handful of these places identified for various reasons that, maybe we shouldn't sell. Maybe there's some special value to these lands for the country. And then you fast forward to the 1890s, and you have the country starts seeing, as we're settling, as we're building new communities all over the country, there's a lot of value to having this timber resource. Like there could be some significant economic value for the federal government to being able to sell timber resources and to manage these forests in a way that ensures a regenerative commodity, that we have forests that we can continue to harvest and use. So Congress passes the Forest Reserve Act, I think in 1891, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And that sets aside tens of millions of acres of timbered land that then cannot be homesteaded or used for other purposes.
That said,
and then go ahead.
Even within the Forest Reserve lands, for example, the Forest Homestead Act, 1906, they recognized that there were some areas there that were within forest reserves that were better suited to agriculture. So there was an opportunity to homestead within those forest reserves. So there are some holdings, and I know a family who has holdings. You're like, how on earth are those grasslands in the middle of the forest in private hands? And they were settled by members of that family, so aunts and uncles and everybody during the Forest Homestead Act time period, and then consolidated within the family later on as aunts and uncles sold to each other and then to their children and whatnot. So part of the reason you'll have some of these private holdings, and it's not all of them. There are little private holdings that where there are different pieces that come in there, but some of these larger holdings within forested areas are because of that.
Yeah, but obviously that was only parcels here and there, right?
Yes.
More, and
it's like 4,000 acres.
So you're starting to see this as you turn into the 20th century. You're starting to see more and more efforts to retain lands in the federal estate. So you have the creation of national forests, more and more national forests being created, excluded from sale. You have the Antiquities Act passed in 1906. And you have things like Devil's Tower created as the first national monument, but shortly thereafter, the Grand Canyon is created as a national monument, and the what's now Olympic National Park, was created as a national monument. And you have this expansion of national monuments using the Antiquities Act. You have wildlife refuges created, and big chunks of land set aside because they're viewed as really important wildlife habitat at the early stages, particularly for migratory birds. And so you have, again, more and more reservations of land, more national parks being created, more national monuments being created, all of the national forests being created. And you have lands in the midst of all of this. You have back into the 1870s and fast forwarding a bit, you also have settlements, treaties entered into with Native people, right, with the Native Americans, and having lands transferred to them, 574 federally recognized tribes, and 326 areas administered as federal Indian reservations, In the lower 48, that meant 56 million acres. And in 1971, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act had Congress conveying an additional 45.7 million acres of land to indigenous people to settle native land claims in Alaska. And again, that's taken then out of general homestead settlement, that sort of thing. You had national grasslands created. And this all led to a point, like all of the land transfers or all of the land sales, all of the land withholding, like keeping in the federal state, all led to this moment in 1976 that I would argue set the stage then for the fights that we're dealing with today. Right.
Before we get to FLTMA, 1976.
Yeah.
Again, just kind of expanding on the water issues in the West, there were a couple of changes to the Homestead Act, of course, with that when they recognized, and I think this is cool American history too, there was a need, west of the 100th meridian, you couldn't grow on 120 acres. So some of the changes that you saw were, for example, was the Enlarged Homestead Act in 1909 that recognized the dry nature of places like Nebraska. And so they started giving away 320 acres. And those 320 acres, people were encouraged to try and produce on those 320 acre parcels of dry land, which, led to the Dust Bowl. Because you had this issue where you had folks who were trying to make a living, just turning over whatever they could, and using, practices that probably weren't right for that region. And so that, contributed to the Dust Bowl. And then in the West in 1916, you had the Stock Raising Homestead Act, again, where you now had 640 acres of public land for ranching purposes. Why? Because people started to recognize that in the West, you couldn't grow corn. What you could grow is a cow that would wander around and eat pieces of grass. And so that contributes to the nature of the West and how it is. There's these huge expanses of land and this recognition that if you're going to make a living as a farmer and you can't water corn, you need to be able to grow something else that uses less water. And that inevitably uses more land in order to, create a living for one individual. And that is why these private ranches in Wyoming, I believe, are the largest size private ranch in the United States of America, per owner is in Wyoming. Why? Because it takes 8,000 acres plus to be able to afford to buy a Ford pickup truck. And that's just kind of, adds to the way that the West looks. Okay, Dave, sorry about that.
Yeah. So all of this was leading to a head in the 1970s. And there were a lot of things going on at the same time. It's not just this FLTMA passing, Federal Land Policy and Management Act. Go back to the 1960s. There was this law, a 1964 law, that was called the Classification and Multiple Use Act. And that law required the Bureau of Land Management to identify lands for retention or disposal and lands to manage for multiple uses. By 1970, the BLM had classified more than 90% of these unreserved public lands for retention. At that same time, Congress created the Public Land Law Review Commission to review existing public land laws and regulations. That commission issued a report that contained dozens of recommendations to improve federal land management. And its first recommendation was to keep public lands under federal ownership unless the lands would, quote, achieve maximum benefit for the general public in non-federal ownership, end quote. And the commission believed that most public lands would not achieve maximum public interest in private ownership. That commission, and I'm highlighting that commission because in the second step of this discussion, I actually think this would be a perfect opportunity to start that again.
Hit the name of that commission again.
So that commission was the Public Land Law Review Commission. Okay. So this was bringing a whole bunch of people together to talk about how should we manage these lands? What should we do with these? So we have all these lands we tried to sell for so long. We can't seem to get rid of them. There seems to be some momentum in the country now to retain these lands in the public for public use and for public benefit. And this is all happening, by the way, as this turns into what becomes FLIPMA, these recommendations from this commission, turns into this 1976 law that ended homesteading formally and limited the disposition of the federal estate. At the same time this was happening, so FLIPMA has passed, and it's this, and we've talked about it a ton, so we don't need to go into a ton of detail, but it creates this multiple use mandate. Say we're no longer going to homestead, we're going to retain these lands in the public estate, and we're going to manage these for multiple uses, and it lists the types of things, defines what that is. And at the same time that's happening, go ahead.
I was going to say, I want everybody to kind of put this in your headspace, what that looked like pre-FLIPMA. So you had everything basically that people could settle in 1970. It was basically settled. Everything next to water that you could grow something on, it was growing. And so what did the rest of this federal estate look like, the rest of this BLM land? As Dave says about what do you call it when you go into the wilderness? What is it? Well, you like wilderness?
A libertarian paradise?
A libertarian. The rest of it's a libertarian
Anything
paradise.
Goes?
Anything goes. Like if you're out on these BLM lands, like, you wanted to ride a motorcycle across the middle you just did it, just roll the throttle on and go. You wanted to have a Jeep race, you just did it, just roll the throttle on and go. And so there was, and that plays into how people feel about this public lands issue today in Utah. It was a libertarian paradise. There was this public estate, and you could use it for whatever you wanted. You could do whatever you wanted, camp wherever you wanted, build a road wherever you wanted. And I mean, there are roads that I know of that are like, would never get permitted today. They were built by private entities at that time.
Some that maybe you created back in your
I didn't.
dirt bike days.
I wasn't I wasn't
motocross days.
Yeah, that's side track. I did work for a federal agency, and my first boss told me when you're driving the pickup around, he said, if you look in your rear view mirror and you can see tire tracks, you're on a road.
Oh man, there's some truth to that still probably today. So the thing I was going to mention, so FLIPMA passes, and the other thing that's happening at the exact same time in this country is you have this massive environmental movement going on, and a preservationist type of movement going on. So things that happen right around the same time. You have the Endangered Species Act that comes online, for example, right? You have the Wilderness Act that comes online in this. When I say this, I don't mean the exact year, but within a decade kind of thing. Like the Wilderness Act is out there in the 1960s and 1970s. Like Wild and Scenic Rivers Act passes, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. Like all of these things are coming online, and all of these additional layers that are added onto public lands in the West. Because remember, everything from the 100th Meridian East, a lot of that's sold. And a lot of those national forests that exist in the East now were not created the same way as the national forests in the West. The national forests in the West were reserved out of the federal estate. The national forests in the East, a lot of them were purchased or acquired out of the private estate and recreated as national forests. Right? So they were not necessarily established the same way. So when you're carving something out of, when you're taking something where it used to be this libertarian paradise where everything goes, and then you're starting to layer on law after law after law that have different types of restrictions, different types of regulations, telling you what you can and can't do, creating wilderness areas, designating wilderness areas where no mechanized use is allowed, right? Creating wild and scenic rivers where your opportunity to build a reservoir is gone, right? And protecting endangered species through the Endangered Species Act, which is creating regulatory burdens potentially on people's grazing practices or other kinds of practices. And then at the same time, you've had 200 years of policy that has said we're trying to privatize all these lands, we're trying to dispose of these lands. And then in one fell swoop in 1976, you create a new policy that says this is now officially the policy of the federal government to retain these lands forever. Like it felt like a perfect storm happened.
What if you
right?
lived in a state where you just basically, you didn't have to care? What if you lived in a small community that was mostly a mining community, and where you took Jeeps and you drove them out across all the rocks and went wherever you want, did whatever you want, and you were 100% surrounded by BLM land, and so you had this libertarian paradise surrounding you, and suddenly somebody started closing gates, or building gates, or telling you couldn't do that, or saying, like, your company that was, you were a mineral extraction company that used to be able to go basically any place you wanted, and there's just very little that was required to get that permit stamped. And now it was much, much harder. Like, what if that's you? And, all these issues, when I say, what if that's you? Well, it doesn't have to be that that's the issue that affects you, because if you look across the board at all these different things, well, that may be what affected you. And for another guy, it might have been an ESA issue. And for another guy, it might have been another issue. But if all these issues come down, if they just happen to coincide and on your world, your rural community where you live, you can see how suddenly you could just have a revolt. You could have a rebellion where people would say, like, no, I'm over it. And they don't have to be over the entire package. There just has to be, each one of them has a piece that they hate. And suddenly you have the makings of a, revolt.
Yeah. Or maybe a rebellion. So the other thing I was going to mention is around FLPMA, to build off of your point. So FLPMA creates this multiple use mandate. And by the way, around the same time, you have the National Forest Management Act, which creates the multiple use mandate for the Forest Service as well. Like
all
how
these,
you manage forests, all these things.
Good
and
things.
Don't forget National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, for how you evaluate projects that occur where there's a federal nexus on federal lands or with federal money or some kind of federal nexus, and how you do take a hard look at the environmental impact that might have. But under FLPMA, this multiple use mandate, like the way that's drafted, it almost invites controversy as well, because, right, like the idea is to say, we can have it all. Right? We can have it all. And we're going to regulate this or manage this in a way to try and have it all. So are we going to have grazing? Yes. Are we going to have mining? Yes. Are we going to have oil and gas development? Yes.
Are we going to have recreation?
Recreation? Yes. Are there going to be some places that we're going to identify as high conservation priorities, areas of critical environmental concern, and limit activities there? Yes. Are there, and associated with that, so how do I identify how we do the different types of uses, these multiple uses? Well, we're gonna do this resource management planning process, right? And we're gonna pick big land areas, and we're gonna do management plans for how we're gonna do management on these lands for the next 10 to 40 years, because these plans don't get updated sometimes that often. And
a reminder,
we're going to involve the local stakeholders, but this is federal land, so it belongs to everybody. So we're also going to involve stakeholders from all over the country on how we're going to manage these things that might be near your town, right? And there's going to be tension. We never had this planning process before, and now we do. And then you have these layers of all these other federal laws, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, NEPA, all these other things on top of it, and then this mandate, and then bringing in all of these different interests of the public to try and say how we're going to manage it. And you know how it is. Nobody can ever get along or agree on everything or anything sometimes. And so now you've gone, again, going back 200 years to let's get rid of it all, to now let's keep it all and try and make everybody happy. That's super hard, right? Like that's super, super hard.
Yeah. Dave, you know how you get 50 people to agree on a sandwich?
No.
You just don't. That's how everybody ends up eating peanut butter sandwiches. Because And that's what happens. This is consensus building. And that's what public lands policy is. Public lands policy is not going into Jimmy John's. I love you, Jimmy John's. You should sponsor this podcast. But it's not going into it is not going into Jimmy John's and getting exactly what you want really fast. It's not going to happen. What you're going to do is you're going to get a picnic basket and you're going to get a peanut butter sandwich. Why? Because it's consensus building. And everybody has to agree and everybody has to work together and come to consensus on what kind of sandwich they can eat. That is essentially public lands policy. And what that means is that we're not always going to, I'm not always going to get, a dirt bike road everywhere that I want. I'm also there are areas where I'm not going to get wilderness protections. Both of those things are going to happen. And that is public lands policy. It is inherently, being willing, not being willing to, it's requiring you to trade and to find consensus. And part of what we run into now is, and it's gotten worse over time, in this political experiment since the 1970s, right? As polarization increases, so too do these dramatic fights over public lands, because people have forgotten the public lands are a bipartisan issue. These laws that we're talking about, FLTMA and the Endangered Species Act, these are bipartisan laws. These are passed under a Republican president. And so when you think about these things, just, you've got to keep that in focus, because now the more partisan we get, the more people want to break these things down and throw them away and throw away what has essentially been, a valuable experiment that isn't that old, Dave. How old are you? You don't need to tell everybody. But
not as old as FLTMA.
Yeah. Well, I am, Dave. I'm as old as FLTMA. And it's not that old. And that's the thing, is like when we think about these things, it's not that old. And, you talked about a BLM resource management plan that can be 40 years old. How old are most of us listening to this podcast? Think about that. This is, again, it's just important that we have perspective as we go into these arguments.
How long have we been recording this?
An hour and 16 minutes. We're almost done with our first half.
Okay, yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to go like another 5-6 minutes, and then we're going to cut this off, and then we're going to record another episode on part 2, because this is just going to get out of control long, I think. But I want to be able to wrap a bow around all this history, but we haven't really said the why yet.
We haven't talked
about the...
Okay, go ahead. The why are we here?
The why are we here? The why did Senator Lee feel the need to ask for the sale of millions of acres of public lands? And then the where do we go from here? I'm going to try and answer it. I'll try and answer it, and then you try and answer it. Like, we might have different answers. We might have different theories. Here's my theory. I think it's multifaceted. I think you have to understand all of that history we just talked about to kind of understand why there's so much tension, and particularly in a state like Utah. Because, and here's how I'd layer it in a few things. One, you have a number of people in Utah that deeply, deeply believe that when they agreed to give up their claim to all of these unappropriated lands in Utah, all of these federal lands in Utah, when they agreed to that at the time of statehood, they felt like they had a deal with the federal government, and that deal was that the government was going to sell all those lands, was going to privatize those lands. So they've long felt that the government did not hold up its end of the deal, and they got the short end of the stick on this, and then it stymied economic development. Then, on top of that, think about all of the various layers that I talked about, all these different laws. The use of the Antiquities Act in Utah, which Antiquities Acts are used by almost every president. But what's interesting is when you look at the timing of designations, a lot of the major designations occur as a president's walking out the door. They don't do it in the first couple of months of their presidency. It's their legacy thing they do as they're walking out the door. And some of the designations in Utah very significant designations like Bears Ears National Monument, Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, for example, were done at the tail end of the Clinton administration, the tail end of the Obama administration, and really over the objections of a lot of folks on the ground. You know, folks felt like they weren't listened to at all as part of this process. And so, and the thought was these designations, they do a couple of things. One, they take certain uses off the table or make it harder to have some of that multiple use that was there before. Two, that it draws attention to an area. You can designate something on a map, but if you don't provide the resources to actually manage it, but you're drawing this big target on it and drawing a whole bunch of recreational users to it, the argument is you could be doing a lot of harm to the area because you're not adequately resourcing and staffing and so forth to be able to prevent resource degradation and damage. And so I think there was some concern about that. There have been some concerns about certain, like the roadless rule, for example, and what that meant for timber harvest in the state. There were concerns about, closing certain roads and management plans for outdoor recreation uses, because as we know, like you mentioned Moab earlier, a lot of the off-roading there is really off-road vehicle recreation use. That's a really high economic value, tourism value to that part of the state. There are other parts of the state that have that. There are just these different layers, the wilderness designations, the roadless rule, the antiquities designations. I mean, they felt like the rest of the country was looking at the beauty of Utah and just turning it into the nation's national park at the expense of Utahns, of the citizens of Utah. And at some point, something was going to have to give. And they felt like they'd tried numerous times to say, hey, address this problem, like this is an issue for us. Can we work on? They felt like they were pushing rope uphill. They weren't getting anywhere and they were running out of options. And all that's left are these nuclear options of massive sale through Congress or pushing lawsuits to try and dispose of lands. That's my take.
Matt Mead once said, when talking to people about Wyoming, he said, talked about how much we love our wildlife and we love our wide open spaces and everything. And he was talking to a group that included a lot of individuals who were environmentally inclined. And he talked about how much we love the environment and how much we like these things and want to preserve them for our future. And then he said, but know this, we are not a zoo. And that's the key. I think for Utah, that's the challenge of being in some of these western states. What's the percentage of public land in Utah, Dave?
68%, something like that.
It's not Nevada, but it's real high. And the challenge is, you have the folks who live in that state, I think, saying, we are not a zoo. And so the problem is, if you're everybody else's zoo, to them it's a zoo, well, that creates some real challenges when you actually, instead, you're an operation that has to make ends meet for the families and the communities in your state. I don't think that Utah, you talked about, folks in Utah, there are some who think that land should have been made available for private interests. I actually don't know that that's true. And I say this, it's true. Of course, there are some who would think now like we'd like to buy it. But I don't think that overwhelmingly, that wasn't the issue that led to the Sagebrush Rebellion, which happened in the late 70s and was led by Utah Senator Orrin Hatch and pushed by a lot of entities that were seeking to make economic use of those public lands and suddenly didn't like NEPA and FLTMA and all the stuff that was causing them problems and didn't like the way that the federal government was dealing with Utah. That led to the first Sagebrush Rebellion. And then predictably, every time you get a Democrat in the presidency now, you get a renewal of the Sagebrush Rebellion in Utah because people are disappointed about land management decisions, and you have things like these Antiquities Act designations in those presidencies that contrary to what that populace wants. And of course, somebody does that. It relights that fire, and the Sagebrush Rebellion is back again. Mike Lee is a product of the Sagebrush Rebellion. Mike Lee is a product of all of this history, and he may not want the exact same things. And that's something we can't know what those true motivations are, or if there's, because there may be, there certainly are, regardless of the motivations of the person who brings a bill, there's somebody in the back who's thinking, oh, if this happens, I can do something else. If that opens the door for me to implement my plan, if they do that. And so there will always be ulterior motives of people that aren't necessarily at all involved with drafting that bill and moving that bill. But that exists. And those things exist ultimately because, to be frank, they don't care who has the deed and title to the lands. They just want to be able to use them for something differently. And I think that is the danger and the solution to the Sagebrush Rebellion, is that if we can find a way for these folks who live day to day, because we forget about it, right? If you live in Sheridan, and I live in Sheridan, they've already given me my piece of the federal estate, right? I've already taken it. I live on it. I live on my half acre. I've got my, I don't have to worry about dealing with FLTMA. I don't have to worry about environmental policy. None of it affects me because the deed has already been transferred. But if I'm a rancher and I have a bunch of federal estate that makes up part of my working operation, it's suddenly important to me. It's pretty important to me how those policies work, and grazing policies and and road policies. All these things become important to me. And that is what we're dealing with in the West. And ultimately, we'll talk more about potential solutions, but ultimately that is what we're talking about when we talk about this whole history, is we've had this shift in paradigm where we've said, hey, we want to keep some of this public stuff public. But there are people and communities that live with us, the public, as their neighbors. And we have to figure out how to be good neighbors.
Yeah, and I think it's perfectly fair. I think it's perfectly fair to completely disagree with the premise that we should sell public lands or wholesale public lands or even transfer public lands. I think it's fair to have that be a position, and then at the same time be able to acknowledge why some people might think that. And I actually think it's incredibly important to be able to acknowledge why some people might want to sell the federal estate. Because if you don't acknowledge it, then you can't address the underlying issue. And we're going to be back here in 6 months or in a year or in 5 years or 10 years or whenever this sine wave that we've talked about in the past comes back around, we're going to be back here dealing with somebody pushing an idea to sell off public lands again, and feeling like they've been ignored and haven't been heard, and that the issues they have, the concerns they have been, pushed aside and demeaned and not valued in some sort of a way. Like, it is just as fair to criticize somebody, in my mind, for wanting to designate everything, to create a whole bunch of designations, as it is to criticize somebody for wanting to sell it all. Right? Like, how do we have the conversation in the middle? I think that's going to be the next podcast, right? That's part 2 of this.
It is. And I want to mention one more thing before we quit. I want to talk about the Sagebrush Rebellion and keeping the rebels at home. It's a huge mistake. We've seen this online, and I'm just going to be frank. People are politicizing this right now. And some of them are, you know exactly who you are, and I don't know, Dave, probably I shouldn't name names because we're friends with some of them. It is an error, and it's a huge mistake. Why? Well, we talked about the Sagebrush Rebellion before, and when it pops up, when does it pop up? It pops up when you have a Democrat in office, doesn't it? It pops up when, that's when it rekindles every time. This argument rekindles. What was different this time? You had a Republican president. When this went, you had a Republican president, you had a Republican Senate, you had a Republican Congress.
But it started at the end of a Democratic administration.
It
right?
did.
It started with a lawsuit filed last summer in August, right? It started when Biden was still in the White House.
And that's probably a great point to make, because we've had a Republican president and a Democratic president involved in it this time. And I believe that's different. I believe it's new. And when you look at the body of Congress that this was taken in front of, you had it controlled by Republicans. And as of this moment, that argument is over for now. Why? Because the bill is passed. It's headed at this moment to the president's desk. And so the question now for you, who stopped it? The answer is we all did. The answer is that sportsmen did. The answer is that Republicans and Democrats did. The answer is that it is bipartisan. And it was an issue that got made by people like Daines and Sheehy hearing from their constituency and saying, as Republicans, this is important to us. And also by Democrats who may not, many of whom are anti-hunting and anti-gun, who did the exact same thing and said, these lands are important to us. It's bipartisan. If you allow this thing, if you drive this and say, we will make this a partisan issue, and we're going to tell you to vote in a partisan way, you invite this to happen again. You invite the next sagebrush rebellion to occur one more time, and you give fuel to this fire. What has to happen? What has to happen is this needs to be a political issue, but it needs to be a bipartisan political issue. It can't be, you cannot frame this up as Republicans feel one way and Democrats feel another way. And how you vote on this, like that says if you vote Democrat or you vote Republican, that means everything that you believe about this is encapsulated in that. If you do that, we may have won the battle and we will lose the war.
Yeah, I thought this would have been great for the next episode, but I'll double down on it here too. Maybe we talk about it again, because I couldn't agree more. I actually look at it this way.
I can cut this out, Dave, if you want. I can trim this part of the podcast.
No, it's all right. I view this as a, like you said, it's a nonpartisan issue. Anybody that's saying, if you value public lands, vote Democrat, is what you're saying is we're going to have to fight this again 5 years from now or 10 years from now, and every 5 or 10 years for the rest of our lives and the rest of our being. Because if you say if you value public lands, you have to vote Democrat. If you don't want to sell public lands, you have to vote Democrat. Then what you're creating is this wedge, and you're saying you're actually giving space to some people to actually support. You're basically giving a space for people to run as Republicans and claim that they support selling public lands. Whereas I think the way it should be is, and this is maybe just a different way of saying the same thing you said, you have to make this political in that, yeah, if you're voting for, if you want to support a Democrat that supports public lands. If you want to support a Republican that supports public lands, right? Like, make it a priority, make it a campaign issue, make it something where it doesn't matter what party you're in. It just becomes the ethos of both parties. It's something that you actually have agreement on. It's something that everybody agrees is a value and a virtue in this country, that we're not going to sell public lands. It has to be both parties. So you actually have to vote for Republican candidates that are out there saying, don't sell public lands.
And right now, at least in part, we have that. The mistake would be if we move away from that by driving everybody with the wrong political designation to ours, and this is across all issues. If you drive everybody that doesn't have the right letter next to their name away from your issue, you make it an issue that only belongs to that party. And then you drive all the individuals, because you make it a party issue, suddenly you lose 50% of the people who would have been on your side. It's just a giant mistake.
And like I said, it just guarantees you're going to fight this fight forever.
Every
it's
time.
Just the guarantee. And if you have to fight something forever, I was at the state capitol last week. I was speaking at a rally right before the Senate vote at the Wyoming State Capitol in support of public lands. And, one of my last lines was, look, Senator Lee or others like Senator Lee only have to win once. Those of us that don't want to see public lands be sold, we have to win every single time. And if we make it harder for us by making this a politically divisive issue, it becomes even harder to win every time. And one of these times we're going to lose.
You can't afford
Just
to
point blank.
alienate everybody on the, just give it a 50-50 split. You can't afford to have 50% of the country be your enemy because of their political party.
Yep, exactly. So that seems like a good place to wrap this. And then we will record a part 2. We'll release both at the same time. So when you're just like, this is suspenseful, what's next? We're going to talk about how do we address this going forward.
Really,
we just said
we're going to release them both at the same time.
Say what?
We're going to release them both at the same time.
You don't want to? You want to space it out?
No. Well, I figured, this is the July 4th episode. What a better time to talk about federal lands than the 4th of July, Dave.
Right. So wouldn't you release them at the same time?
Well, I think you'd release them one week after another.
Well, I guess we can do that too if you really want. I don't care.
Well, it's all under your control. So just let the general public know, our 10 listeners now, because we have really increased our listenership by tenfold. From 1 to 10. But you have all the control, Dave. I'll mix it down. You decide when it goes out. It's all on you, Dave Wilms.
All right, fine. Well, I'll make that decision. But right now, the decision I'm going to make is I'm going to wrap this one up. And if you want to hear about what do we think, how do we address this going forward, aside from the politics of who you vote for, but like the real solution, how do we get to the brass tacks of like actual some on the ground solutions? That's the next episode. So stay tuned. That's your cliffhanger. Boy, we are nerdy if that's a cliffhanger. And if you fell for that cliffhanger, you might be just as nerdy as we are. But that's the cliffhanger. We'll talk about that next in the next episode. And a quick reminder before I wrap this, send us emails, yourmountain@itsyourmountain.com. Find us on social media. I posted a couple of times for us recently, Nephi. We haven't posted in a year and a half. There's some content now. Maybe we'll do more. I don't know. At the handle @itsyourmountain on Instagram, Facebook. Find us there. Send us a note. Give us a review, preferably 5 stars. And stay tuned for part 2 of this discussion on like the autopsy of the public lands sale provision. Until then, remember that life is about experiences, so go have one.